One of the most commonly asked questions about the DJI Pocket 3 is which memory card do I need in order to get the best results? Well, that's what we're going to try to answer today, so stick around and let's try to find out. So you have your DJI Pocket 3, and one of the first things you're going to decide is which memory card you're going to use in order to get the best results and the best reliability. But there are just so many choices out there, it's hard to know where to even start. So today we're going to try to simplify that process. We're going to take a look at some of the key specifications you need to be looking for. We're going to talk about brands and where to buy your memory cards. And we're also going to do a bit of testing of some of the most popular memory cards out there in order to try to figure out which is the best, or in fact if there's any difference at all between the top brands. Now, there's a lot to cover here, so I'm going to place the chapters up here, and I'll also make that available on the video timeline so you can go directly to the sections you're most interested in. But before we get started, a quick disclaimer, this video is not paid for or sponsored in any way. I purchased the Pocket 3 and all of the memory cards with my own money, and the opinions are entirely my own. And also, if you're enjoying today's video and getting good information out of it, please remember to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel. So let's get on with it. So first off, let's look at what specifications are important for your DJI Pocket 3. Now, if you look at a typical memory card these days, you'll find it is just plastered with symbols and numbers and all kinds of specifications, and it can get pretty overwhelming. But the good news is, like most video cameras, the key specification that you're interested in for your Pocket 3 is the video speed, or V number. Now, currently there are just 5 categories of video speed. There's V6, V10, V30, V60, and V90. Now, this number indicates the minimum sequential write speed that the card is guaranteed to maintain, and it's stated in megabytes per second. So if you have a memory card with a V10 rating, that card is guaranteed to provide a sequential write speed of never less than 10 megabytes per second. So what speed do you need for the Pocket 3? Well, in order to determine that, you need to know the camera's bit rate. Now, the bit rate is how much data is produced for each second of video that the camera generates. Now, the Pocket 3 actually uses different bit rates depending on what mode you're working in, a lot more on that later on. But at its maximum, the Pocket 3 has a bit rate of 130 megabits per second. Now, an important note here, the bit rate is stated in megabits per second with a small b, as opposed to the video speed, the V number that we talked about just a moment ago, which is stated in megabytes per second. Luckily, the conversion is pretty straightforward. If you remember back to basic computer school, you'll know that 1 byte is equal to 8 bits, so converting from one to the other is simply a case of either multiplying or dividing by 8. So in the case of the Pocket 3, we have a bit rate of 130 megabits per second, which equals 16.25 megabytes per second. So clearly a V10 card is not going to be sufficient for this bitrate. So for the Pocket 3 you would need one of at least the next class, which is a V30 card. Now you could also go with a V60 or V90 card, but that's probably overkill for a Pocket 3. Another specification that you might want to look for in a memory card is the read speed. Now basically this is how fast you're going to be able to get the data that's on the card onto your computer or whatever device you are using. Now, just like the write speed, the read speed is also measured in megabytes per second. Now, typically read speeds are a little bit higher than the write speed. And for the type of cards we've been discussing, V30 cards, you'll probably find most of them are in the 100 to almost 200 megabyte per second range. And of course, this can make a big difference in the amount of time you have to wait to transfer your files, particularly if you've been recording a lot of video. Now, there is an important point here, and that is, in order to take full advantage of the read speed of your memory card, you need to use a memory card reader which can support at least that speed. If you typically like to just plug up your Pocket 3 in order to transfer the files over to your computer, you need to know that you're going to be limited to a read speed of around about 40 megabytes per second, regardless of what the read speed of your card is. So it's probably a good idea to invest in a high-speed card reader. I use this one from Lexar, but there are many good choices out there and they're not particularly expensive. One other specification that we want to talk about is card capacity. So what card capacity are you going to need for your vacation, your trip, your YouTube project, whatever the case may be? Now, as we mentioned earlier, the maximum bitrate of the DJI Pocket 3 is 130 megabits per second. And if you do the math, that basically works out to 1 gigabyte equals 1 minute of video recording. So a 64 gigabyte card is going to give you about an hour of recording, a 128 gigabyte card about 2 hours, and so on. But the actual bitrate that your Pocket 3 records at depends on which mode you're shooting in. Let's take a look at an example. Let's place a freshly formatted 256 gigabyte card into our Pocket 3, and we'll set the mode to standard video at 4K 30 frames per second. As you can see, it shows us that we have just over 5 hours worth of recording at these settings. Now this is already almost an hour more than we expected to see. And if you do the math, you'll see that the camera is now calculating that this video will be recorded at a bitrate of 110 megabits per second. But even this is exaggerated. And as you can see, by the time we finish our 1 hour recording, instead of the available recording time going down to 4 hours, as we would have expected, it shows now 4 hours and 24 minutes of remaining recording time. So in reality, when you're shooting at 4K 30 frames per second, the Pocket 3 actually records at somewhere between 70 and 80 megabits per second. So if you're recording mostly in 4K 30 frames per second, you'll get almost double the amount of recording time as you would recording at 130 megabits per second. Now, if you're doing a lot of recording in 4K 60 frames per second, or using the slow motion mode, which records at 4K at 120 frames per second, then the bitrate will be much higher, and your available recording time, of course, will be lower, and we'll see the details of that in the next section. But for most standard recording, as you can see, maybe you don't need as big a card as you might initially have thought. And one other tip here, instead of just going for one card that will cover your entire vacation or entire project, you may want to consider going for multiple smaller cards. The reason being that your camera could of course get lost or stolen with the card in it, or the card could become corrupted to the point where you can no longer retrieve the data off it. In either case, you're much better off having multiple cards with your files on rather than have everything on a single card. And one final tip in this section, always remember to format the card in the camera that you plan on using it. So that would mean when you first use the card, anytime you move the card from one camera to another, and it's also a good idea to format the card periodically to minimize the possibility of the file system corrupting and losing your data. So let's talk about what brand of memory cards you should use in your Pocket 3. Now, I'm not here to advocate for any particular brand of memory card, but when it comes to memory cards, this is one product you don't want to go cheap on. I highly recommend you go with a known and established memory card brand. These products are the result of extensive research. They are produced in optimized manufacturing environments, and these companies have stringent and externally accredited quality assurance system to give you a product that you can rely on. If you think of the consequences of going with some cheap off-brand, you could easily end up losing your entire vacation videos or your YouTube project videos, whatever the case may be. It's just not worth the risk. Of course, you can experience problems even with some of these known brands, but the probability is going to be much lower. And also, it's important where you buy your memory cards. There is a significant knockoff market for memory cards, and if you find a deal on eBay or Amazon Marketplace for a popular memory card which seems too good to be true, it is too good to be true. So the bottom line is here, buy memory cards from a known and established memory card manufacturer, and buy them also from a known and trusted supplier. And that brings us to the brands that we're going to be looking at today. Now, I realize there are other brands out there that I might not have included here, but this is just a collection of 5 brands that are the most familiar to me. All of the cards are 256 gigabyte cards, with one exception that I will mention, and of course they are all V30 rated cards. So in alphabetical order, here's the list of cards that we're going to be testing. Firstly, the Kingston Canvas Go Plus, read speed of 170 megabytes per second, write speed 90 megabytes per second, and a current street price of around $26. Next up, the Lexar 1066X Silver Series card. Now, this has been my go-to card for the last few years, so it will be very interesting to see how it stacks up against the others in the list. The read speed of this card is 160, write speed 120, and the current street price is $23. Next up, something of a budget choice, the PNY Pro Elite. Read speed 100, write speed 90, and current street price just $20, so this is the least expensive of the bunch. Next up, the Samsung Pro Plus. Now this one is a 512 gigabyte card, but I can assure you the read and write specifications are identical to the 256 version at 180 read and 130 write. The 256 gig version comes in at a street price of $25. And finally, the most expensive of the group, the SanDisk Extreme, with a read speed of 190 and a write speed of 130 and a current street price of $27. So the testing I did was for 3 different filming scenarios. Firstly, 4K at 30 frames per second, probably the most common filming scenario that there is for the Pocket 3. Secondly, 4K at 60 frames per second. And for the third test, I used the most demanding filming scenario, which is the 4x slow-mo 4K at 120 frames per second. Now for each of these tests, I ran the recording for 5 minutes, and I ran it multiple times, and the results that you'll see in the next section are the average of those multiple runs. Then I also did an extended test for 1 hour at 4K 30 frames per second. And finally, I did a read test by taking each card, placing it in a high-speed card reader, and timing the transfer of the largest file from my testing in order to see just how close each one comes to its claimed read speed. Okay, let's talk about the results. Now, as we discussed earlier, and as long as the manufacturers are not making false claims, the write speed of all of these cards is far beyond anything that the Pocket 3 can throw at them. So I assumed that when I did these tests, it would simply be a case of the card works or the card doesn't work. But as you'll see in a few moments, there's a lot more to it than that. So I'm going to start out with the results from the 4x slow-mo test. So this is recording at 4K 120 frames per second. And in this mode, and only in this mode, is where the Pocket 3 is using its maximum bitrate of 130 megabits per second. And for this test, it really was just simply a case of confirming that the cards functioned as expected. And that's exactly what we saw. All 5 cards performed flawlessly and generated an identically sized file, which, when you do the math, turns out to exactly 130 megabits per second. So for this particular test, all cards performed equally. So let's turn our attention to the 4K 30 frames per second tests. Now here too, all cards did the job without any issues, but when I looked at the data afterwards, there was quite a difference in the final file sizes between the different cards. And of course, the file size is determined by the bitrate. Now you want the bitrate to be as high as possible, because that means that more data is being stored for each frame of your video, so you should be seeing higher quality at a higher bitrate. The average bitrate that I saw at 4K 30 frames per second, at least in these 5-minute runs, was just under 70 megabits per second, with the PNY card being the lowest at under 60 megabits per second, and the SanDisk being the highest at almost 80 megabits per second. Now, I should point out that there were also variances from run to run, even on the same card, but by averaging out over multiple runs, what you're seeing here is the most representative data for each card. Now, it's my understanding that what you are filming can also impact the bitrate. So for example, if you're filming a very complex scene with lots of movement, it might result in a higher bitrate, whereas if you're filming a static scene with very little variation, you might see a lower bitrate. So for all of these tests, to avoid that variable, the camera was set up stationary, facing pretty much the same static scene. So for the 4K 30 test, we have to say that the SanDisk seemed to perform the best and the PNY performed the worst. I think the surprise result for me in this particular test was the Samsung, which was just a little bit better than the PNY. So let's take a look at the 4K 60 frames per second results. Now for 4K 60, we saw an average bitrate of 109 megabits per second, with a 3-way tie for the best results, the Kingston, Samsung, and SanDisk all at 115 megabits per second, and the Lexar and PNY bringing up the rear at around 100 megabits per second. And finally, for the write tests, let's look at the extended test. Now, if you recall, this is a 1-hour recording at 4K 30 frames per second, and here, as you can see, the results are a lot closer. Over the course of the hour, the average bitrate that we saw was 69 megabits per second, with once again the SanDisk coming out on top with 71, and the Kingston in this case bringing up the rear at 66. And finally, let's take a look at the read speed results. So first off, I would say that all manufacturers came in below their advertised read speeds, with the Kingston being considerably below its claimed read speed. And in the case of the SanDisk, I should point out that this is probably more a limitation of my card reader than of the card itself. But even with that limitation, you can see that once again the SanDisk came out on top with 168 megabytes per second, and the PNY not surprisingly being the slowest at 93. So, some pretty interesting and unexpected results. As I said earlier on, all of these cards have a write speed fast enough to handle anything that the Pocket 3 could throw at them. And in fact, when it came to the toughest test, the 4K 120, 130 megabits per second test, all of them did the job just fine without any difficulty. So it was quite surprising that at 4K 30 and 4K 60 with lower bit rates that we saw such a difference from card to card in the actual recorded bitrate. But the question is then, is that difference in the bitrate something you're going to notice in the quality of your videos? Well, I guess that's something I'm going to have to follow up on. As far as these tests are concerned, I think it's fair to say that all of the cards we tested will work just fine with your Pocket 3 and give you good results. I think clearly if I were to pick one card as the winner of these tests, I think the SanDisk consistently performed at the top in every test that we did. All of the others had a few, let's say, disappointing results, and I would say on the overall performance, perhaps the PNY card didn't quite match up to the others in the tests that we did. So that just about wraps it up for today. If you have any comments, if you want to share your experience with the Pocket 3 and particularly with memory cards, please put those into the comments section. As I said, I do have some follow-up work I plan to do here, so please make sure and subscribe to the channel and hit the alert button so you can be notified when that video or others like it post. Also remember to give us a like, and thank you for watching.